Well, good morning. Happy Mother's Day. Glad you're here to my mom, who's probably watching online. Happy Mother's Day, and sorry your gift is not there yet. That's on me. So, just a public apology. Figured that this was more personable than the text message that I'll send you later to again apologize. So, sorry, that did not happen. But anyways, glad you're here. And today, if it makes up to my mom, I'm going to be talking about her father. So hopefully that helps a little bit because she loved her dad. Today, as we begin this brand new series, I'm very excited about this because one of the things today we're going to do is we're going to combine kind of two of my favorite people and passions that I've ever seen happen in my life in one cohesive story. We're going to do our best to do that. So my grandfathers, my mom's dad, my dad's dad, I was lucky enough to get to know both of them in my lifetime. And one of them, he's a farmer. So my grandpa Jack, he was a farmer. His name was Leon Francis Jackson Flanagan. Good luck with that whole mess. And so he was a farmer in Oklahoma, which is a terrible place to farm. If you've ever been to Oklahoma, it's really dry. There's not a lot going on there. There's like hurricane or there's tornadoes like every other day. It's just a miserable place. If you know anything about Oklahoma, literally the state motto of Oklahoma is Oklahoma, it's okay. That's literally what it says on every license plate. It says Oklahoma, it's okay. Like the best they could come up with is, you've seen worse, you've seen better too, but that's how good Oklahoma is. And so in Oklahoma, they made this farm that actually grew like all over the place. It's a huge farm. And my grandfather, he was so dedicated to his craft that I'll never forget one time he was out and working in the field and a tractor had broken. He got down underneath the tractor to try to work on it. My uncle got up in the tractor to try to help and instead ended up moving the tractor and it rolled. It was a full-size, massive John Deere tractor, rolled over my grandfather's hand, crushed all of the bones in his hand. Just literally crushed them like they were disintegrated. And the doctor came out to the house because they live in one of those places where doctors come to your house because there's no city anywhere nearby. Doctor came to the house, bandaged up his hand. It was just enormous. And I remember my grandfather looking at his hand and looking at the doctor and saying, I'm going to have a hard time getting a work glove over that. And the doctor said, well, you won't need to when you're on the couch. And he said, and the next day he went out working. And so he just was so dedicated to being a farmer. And we're going to talk about that a little bit today. Secondly, we're going to talk about storytelling. We're going to talk about not just sowing and seeds and soil and all the things that go into farming, but we're going to talk about storytelling. Now, I know these two don't sound as intermixed as maybe you might think they are, but hopefully we'll get there. My other grandfather, my dad's dad, he was in Middletown, Ohio his entire life, Grandpa Gerald. And I'll tell you, I've never met a better storyteller in my life. He just was one of those guys that could make anything into a story. I'll never forget, there was a time we went to Kroger. You guys know Kroger if you're from the north, right? My dad, by the way, he grew up in the north. There was a Kroger near him. And apparently when he was young, decided to be mischievous and broke the K off of the Kroger sign because my dad's name was Roger. And so then it just said Roger on the store instead of Kroger. He was very proud of that. And so we went to the Kroger one day, and we were pulling in, and the gas station was closed at the Kroger. There's a gas station next to it. It was closed, and this became headline news. And I watched my grandfather the rest of the day go throughout the town, every person he talked to, and he would start talking to them and be like, so guess what? I pulled into the Kroger today. Gas station's closed. People would be like, what happened? He'd be like, I don't even know. There are cones up, gas station's closed. And somehow he would tell this story in a way that people thought it was interesting. I couldn't figure it out. And he would tell these stories over and over again. I remember with my grandfather in Ohio, you would sit in the seats with him as he would drive he always had a new Chevy truck, as he would drive his Chevy truck through town, and he would tell you the same stories at the same corner of the same street every single time you passed by it, but somehow it was still interesting. He was an incredible storyteller. And today, both my grandfathers, we're going to kind of put both those together because the best part, if you remember this as a kid, if you ever grew up with grandfathers that lived in different places, Ohio, Oklahoma, whatever it might be, the coolest thing was when your grandparents were in the same place at the same time. Does anyone remember this? Where you'd be like, oh my goodness, what are we doing here? It felt like a crossover episode of a show that you really liked. You'd be like, we're both here at the same time. It was so cool. And so that's what we're going to try to do is kind of mix those two things together. I'm just going to warn you, as we start this series today, those are kind of two different topics we're going to cover. I'm going to try to get to both of them and make sense out of both of them because as we begin this series, this first piece that we're going to cover is foundational to the rest. It really is very, very important. We're going to be talking about what the kingdom of heaven is like. Now, I know that that might sound really weird and it might sound really nebulous. If you're not used to this language, you might be like, I don't know how do I grab hold of the kingdom of heaven? What is that? What is that? And to be honest with you, as we go through the next few weeks, you might get a clearer picture and you also might get a murkier picture. I don't know how to explain it to you. What we're going to see is that Jesus even does not give us a lot of bullet points about the kingdom of heaven. He does not give us a lot of details. He is somewhat vague about it. But what we see is in a few chapters of the Bible, Jesus explicitly stops to teach on the kingdom of heaven. And when he does, he starts off these sentences saying the kingdom of heaven is like, and then he tells a story. He doesn't say the kingdom of heaven is like streets of gold and it's like mansions that are built for you. He doesn't say the kingdom of heaven is like pearly gates where St. Peter is waiting to talk to you. He never tells us those descriptors. He doesn't say the kingdom of heaven is like your favorite day lived over and over and over again where you just are self-caring like crazy in heaven. You know, it's just like a long bubble bath. That's what the kingdom of heaven is like. He never says this. This is not what he describes. When he talks about the kingdom of heaven, he tells these stories. And honestly, the stories are always rooted in things here on earth. They're things that we can relate to, that we can understand. And today we're gonna talk about not just the how and the pieces of what he's talking about with kingdom of heaven. He's gonna talk about what, which is the sowing and the soil and the farming piece. But we're also gonna look at the storytelling side because he's gonna tell us why he uses stories so much to explain the kingdom of heaven. And we're going to try to get into both of those today, okay? So if you have a Bible or a phone or whatever, we're going to try to go as quickly through this as possible. I'm just going to warn you, we're not going to get to the depths of this today, but we're going to be in Matthew chapter 13. This is where Jesus begins this teaching. Again, if you remember anything about the kingdom of heaven, Jesus talks about the kingdom of heaven more than any other subject in the entire Bible. He talks about more than he talks about money. He talks about more than he talks about, especially like church or even the word salvation. He talks about this kingdom of heaven over and over again. 90 times it shows up. And this is what it says in Matthew chapter 13. So Matthew 13, it begins right at the beginning, verse 1. I'd encourage you to follow along if you can, just because I want you to see everything that's going on here, and again, to make sure I'm not lying or something. It says this, that same day, so this is the parable of the sower, if you're familiar with that. That same day, Jesus went out of the house and sat by the lake. So he just goes out of a house that he's staying in. Remember, Jesus did not have a home of his own. He always is staying with somebody else. He's like constantly that guy that just crashed on your couch. And he's just doing that. He's like the Kramer of most people's lives, I'm sure. And so he just shows up and hangs out with people as long as he can, and then he moves on. But he is at this house, and we don't know exactly which one, but he's in a home, and then he goes out by the lake. He's just hanging out by the lake. And it says, such large crowds gathered around him that he got into a boat and sat in it while all the people stood on the shore. Now, this isn't just Jesus being antisocial. This isn't like Jesus is angry, or he's like, I just don't want to be around crowds, or he's afraid of, he's like, hey, 6 feet away, please. He's not doing that. That's not what he's worried about. What he is worried about is actually there's so many crowds that he can't speak to them well. So what would be a normal practice in this day is that a speaker would get into a boat and they would actually go out onto the lake because actually the acoustics were better. Sound carried over the water better than it does over land. And so they would speak from the boat so that more people could hear them. It was almost like an amphitheater situation where they'd be down in the water looking up on a hillside and speaking up to everybody, and they would be able to hear it better. So he gets into this boat, he sits in it, and he begins to teach. It says, verse 3, then he told them many things in parables. Many things, okay? And it says, a farmer went out to sow his seed. Let's stop there for just a second. A farmer went out to sow his seed. I want you to just take a quick second, and maybe we should do this just before we get into this. Take a quick second, and what I want you to do is, if you've been around church, you've probably heard this story. You probably know this story. You might have an idea of the story. You've probably seen like a Max Lucado book about it. You've probably seen some kind of Thomas Kincaid painting about it, to be honest. There's probably something that you have an understanding of this parable, the sower story. What I want you to do is just for a second, I want you to pretend like you do not know this story. I want you to put yourself on the hillside as there's a man out in the boat who has, according to all of our movies, he has crazy hair. And he's apparently he's white though for some reason. I can't explain that part of the movies that we don't understand. And he's got a British accent because Jesus always does in all the films, even though I don't know if you know where he grew up. It's not, don't have British accents. But I want you to picture at least a man who is out in the boat, a rabbi. And he is teaching this story, and you've never heard this story before. You don't know where he's going with the story. You don't know the explanation of the story. You don't know the whole meaning of the story. All you get is this story. I want you to think about that for just a second and put yourself in those shoes. Because to the majority of the people in this moment, they will never get the explanation to this story. So what's going to happen is Jesus is going to tell this story to a crowd. He will explain it later, but it will only be explained to the disciples. It will not be explained to everybody, so only 12 people get to know the meaning of the story, not everybody who was on that hillside that day. And Matthew will not write the explanation to it until at least 30 years later. Most people will never know the explanation of this story. And I want you to put yourself in those shoes for just a second as we read this story. Pretend like you don't know the end of the story. You don't know what all of it means yet. And see what questions you come up with as you go through this. What you would be like, hey, I would like more explanation about this if you're talking about the kingdom of heaven. He says, a farmer went out to sow his seed. As he was scattering the seed, some fell along the path, and birds came and ate it up. So we've got this farmer in this scene, right? He's walking down a path, and he is scattering seeds. So this morning I brought this, just so you know, this actually is my wife's Mother's Day present. She wanted an orange tree for our backyard. To be honest, I'm not sure why, because we have killed literally every plant we've ever had. But this year is different. This is our year. It's 2021, guys. And so she wanted an orange tree, so I went to a nursery yesterday and got this. But in true romantic fashion, I'm going to use it as a prop in a sermon before I give it to her. It's how you show love, guys. It's beautiful, isn't it? So there's this picture that we get of a man who is going out and he's sowing seeds, right? And we know the farmer, that's a very normal picture for, especially an agrarian culture that Jesus is talking to. And so he's walking down this path. He's trying to plant something that will grow. He's trying to plant something that will eventually make it into existence and be a thriving, producing plant. That's what he's trying to create, right? And it says that he's walking down this path and he starts scattering seed, but he's just walking down, apparently not super worried about where the seed goes, and he starts throwing it. So as he walks down the path, he just throws some right on the path. Now, this is not a great location. If you know anything about planting things, this is not where you want them to be planted. But he throws it on the path, and some of it ends up there. Notice that. So it says that he, as he walked along, it fell along the path, and birds come and pick it up and eat it. Birds. Which, according to some people, if you've watched the internet recently, are not real. Birds are not real. There's a whole conspiracy theory that's pretty great, that birds are just a drone from the CIA that are just watching us. And they go sit on the power lines to recharge, and the rest of the time they're just watching us. I wish this was a joke. I was actually teaching a speech class right downstairs here at the college last semester, and I had a student who got up in front of the class to start doing his speech, and he's like, the government has always used mind control to keep populations at bay. And he has this long introduction. I'm like, where is he going with this? And then he turns to me, he's like, and that's why today I'd like to talk about the fact that birds aren't real. I started laughing because I thought it was a joke. I don't think he did. And it's a really good speech, though. He did a really good job. He got an A. And I will say, as he was speaking about birds not being real, a bird, no joke, a bird came to the window and was like pecking on the window while he's talking. And at that point, I was like, maybe he's right. Maybe this thing's coming in to silence him as he brings the truth to light, that birds aren't real. Anyways, so this bird/government drone comes down to the earth, and it picks up the seed because it's been left along the path. Not a good place for a seed. There's these birds that come in and pick it up. Then it says, the next verse, some fell on rocky places where it didn't have much soil. It sprang up quickly because the soil was shallow. So he's walking along. He continues to just scatter seeds along, but he finds just rocky path. This wouldn't be a good place for anything to grow. And it starts to grow, but it doesn't really go anywhere. Now, this would be common, especially in Middle Eastern culture. If you look in Palestine specifically, most of the ground there is limestone. And so limestone is right underneath the surface of most of the sand and the soil. So what would happen is dew would rest upon that limestone, and it would look like a place where something could grow. It was wet and it looked fertile, but at the end of the day, there was nowhere for that plant to actually grow. It just sat on top of rocks, and that would be the end of it. We see that one. That just happens to be on this rocky soil. It sprang up quickly, but because the soil was shallow, it couldn't grow. But then the sun came up, and the plants were scorched because they withered, and they withered because they had no root. So then other seed, again, he's pretty careless with the seed. He scatters it, and it goes among the thorns. And as the thorns happen, this plant starts to grow, but then it's choked out by the thorns around it. It's choked out. It can't seem to grow. So we can picture that in our own yards. You know how the dandelions and the weeds and the things can grow, and they literally choke out the thing you were hoping would actually happen. That is what I'm most afraid of happening to this orange tree that is a symbol of love. And then it says, lastly, verse 8, still other seed fell on good soil. It produced a crop 160 or 30 times what was sown. So we see this last one where something actually lands in the soil where it should be, and where it lands is in a place where it can actually grow. It will now be able to actually spring up into something. Now, we read that, and I don't know what questions you have as you hear this story. Imagine that you've never heard this story before. Imagine you're on a hillside, and you don't know the answers to all these things. I would have some questions. I don't know about you, but I would have some questions about this. My questions, I would have a few. One would be, I would be going, okay, so who am I in the story? Would you agree with that one? Like, so I'd be asking, first of all, who am I? Like, which one am I in the story? Am I the sower? Am I the seeds? Am I the soil? Where am I at in the story? Secondly, I'd be asking, where are you, Jesus? So you're probably in this story somewhere too. Who are you in the story? Are you the sower? Are you the seeds? Are you the soil? What's your job in this? Where does God show up in the story? I'm assuming he's in here somewhere. Where are you in this story? Then I'd be asking, so what does this mean? So what's the meaning of this story, right? Like, so if I'm one of these characters and there's another character in this, then what does it mean at any age right now? I think this is maybe the most important conversation we can have. We're going to talk about identity on Wednesday nights. We're doing a whole different study than what we're going to do on Sunday mornings. You'll want to be in a group for that. You'll want to go through this study together. I think it's one of the most important things we can talk about right now is our identity. Because that's one of the most important things to us in our culture is what our identity is. It truthfully is. And we'll get into that. I will not go into that too much today. But we have to realize where our identity comes from in order to really live that out in the world around us. And here we see that we realize our identity when we first understand God's identity. This is why A.W. Tozer, you remember, he wrote that the most important thing about us is what we think about God. Because what we think about God, if we think he's mean or he's malicious, or if we think he's somebody that's very kind and loving, or whatever we think about God, will reflect in how we think about ourselves. And we find our identity, we find God's first. And so in this story, I see the same thing. I would say I would find God's identity, Jesus' identity in this first, and then I would be like, oh, okay, this is where my identity is. So that gives me a picture of what I am. Notice in that, as I look at the story of this and I look at the identity of Jesus, do you notice how he is not forcing anything upon the soil? It doesn't say that Jesus went out and he tilled up the soil. It doesn't say the sower went out and he dug up all the dirt and then he forced the seeds into the dirt. Then he put the dirt back on and he made all these things happen. Notice he doesn't say that. He does not say that he worked the soil until it was usable or that he did something violent to it. He never does this. This is not the way God works. Our God is not one who forces himself upon us. He is one who woos us in. He's one who calls us in. And it tells us a little bit of his identity. And as we look at this, his identity is a God who loves and gives us this free will of how we accept the message that he's giving to us. So I can see these things happening if I'm taking the story apart at a cursory level, right? And then I would assume, so that what does this story mean? So what's the meaning of this story? So let's take that apart for just a quick second. If I'm looking at the story from some kind of point of view through maybe just the first listening, I would be like, okay, so probably it means something about I need to hear and be receptive to, maybe even curious about what Jesus is talking about. I need to be curious about this kingdom thing and start to understand it a little bit more. I need to be kind of curious towards it and have a soft heart towards it. What we're going to find is that this is all about the softness of your heart. This is all about having soil that is good and that literally is a softness of the heart, which is something we're not very good at. But I would have an assumption that that's something about it, and that in my softness in my heart is how this will grow. This thing's going to grow. I would assume something about that, and then I would say, what do I need to do about that? We're going to get into that in just a second. What do I need to change to have that kind of heart, to have that kind of soil for this? And then, lastly, we would talk about what are the birds and what are the thorns, and we'll get into that in just a little bit. So those would be the questions I would ask. Now, Jesus says this line right after that is just this beautiful capstone to his story. It's in verse 9. It says this, whoever has ears, let them hear. That might sound very simplistic, but he's saying, no. You heard the story. Like you heard it, you got a cursory hearing of it, but let them hear it. Whoever has ears, don't just hear it. I want you to listen. I want you to lean into this. I want you to let this absorb into you. Let me tell you this. Today, we are going to go, again, through this story just a little bit. It is one of those things, as you go through this story, as you think it through more and more and more, this story will show up. It's like when you're buying a new car. You know how when you buy a new car, all of a sudden you start to see that car everywhere around you. Every road you turn down, everything, you're like, oh, that's the same car, that's the same car, that's the same car. That's what's going to happen with this story, I promise you. If you understand the story, if you start to really take it in, what Jesus is saying is don't just listen to it once. You've got to let this thing wash over you, because the more you understand, the more you listen to it, the more it will transform and change who you are. It can't just be a one-time listen and then walk away from it. This story is too important. Whoever has ears, let them hear. In fact, I would say as every time we think we get this story right, we probably have it wrong. Every time we think we've gotten to the place where we're the good soil and we're doing everything right, we probably need to relook at it and start over again, just so you know. That's the way a lot of these parables are going to go. Now, it says that he says this beautiful story. He nails this point that he thinks he's made. He tells a story and he walks away, right? But notice the next verse, verse 10. The disciples came to him and asked, why do you speak to the people in parables? So the disciples come up and they're like, hey, if you're talking about the kingdom of heaven, why are you talking about this in parables? Now, I think we want to ask the same question if we're honest with ourselves. If you're like me, if you're like, hey, Jesus, I want you to tell me about the kingdom of heaven. What I want you to do, Jesus, is I want you to make a PowerPoint presentation. I want there to be bullet points that tell me exactly what it is and exactly how I become part of it. I don't know if you ever feel this way. Where you're like, Jesus, let's be more direct. Let's make it very, very succinct. Let's use little bullet points. Let's make a spreadsheet out of it. And I can just check the checklist and get through this. And the disciples come up to him and they're like, hey, why do you keep talking in parables? Now, first of all, let's talk about why I think Jesus is talking about parables. I think Jesus uses parables because if you're being honest with ourselves, there is a fact, there are facts, there are scientific facts that you and I can look at and we will argue about them. I know that's crazy. But think about this for just a second. If I showed you a study, it could be a poll, it could be a study that is scientifically researched. And I could say that 80% of this or 90% of that is this or that way. And you would look at that poll, I guarantee you would look at that study and go, yeah, I don't believe it. If you don't believe me, read the news. Watch a news channel. Watch how they differently interpret the exact same study. It's amazing how science has actually made us more divided on these things. But you know what you can't argue with? You can't argue with a story. You can't argue with a story. It has things to it that you just cannot argue about. When I tell somebody my personal story, they cannot argue with the facts that have happened to me. And Jesus, I think, is using story because he's like, if I tell you all the bullet points of the kingdom of heaven, if I came in theologically and just laid all that out, I think half of you would be like, yeah, I don't think so. So let me tell you a story instead. Now, we know that stories work, and I deal with this a lot, but we know that stories work. Your brain, by the way, is wired for story. Jesus, I believe, knows this to the core of his being. What happened is there's really three hemispheres in our brain. We talk about the right and the left a lot. And if you know anything about your right side of your brain is the creative side of your brain, right? So this creative part of your brain is the right side. And then the left side of your brain is the logical side, right? You have all the logic and all the things. I did a test one time to see if I was right-brained or left-brained. It turned out that I was about 80% right-brain, which means that only about 20% of my brain balances our checkbook, which is not good. I'm not good at the logic side. I'm more on the creative side. But then there's this other part that's in the frontal lobe of your brain. It's called the amygdala. And the amygdala is the emotional part of your brain. It's the responsive part of your brain. And what happens when a story is told is it's one of the few times that your entire brain works together. All of it's working because you're hearing facts, and you're hearing a creative piece, and it has emotions to it, has a feeling tied to it. When you hear a story, that's what happens. And what's interesting, if you ever read like Simon Sinek's book, Start With Why, or things like that, what you'll find is that we do not make decisions that are logical. This is a fact. You can look this up and you can debate with me about it later. But you can look up this fact that actually in your brain, you do not make decisions that are logical. We think that we use that left side of our brain, that side that is supposed to be for the logic and the facts, to make every decision we make. The truth is that part of your brain cannot make decisions. It is not even involved in the decision-making process. The first part of your brain that makes a decision is the amygdala, the emotional part of your brain. And then what you use is you use facts to back it up later. That's just to back up the emotional decision you've already made. The part of your brain that makes a decision when you're buying that thing or talking to that person or whatever it is, the part of you that already makes that decision is the emotional response of your brain. That's where decisions are made. And then you use that logical side later to back it up. And Jesus knows this, that he's going to speak in story because that's maybe the best way to get past the things that you're going to argue with, the things that you're going to say I don't agree with or whatever. And he's going to give a bigger and broader picture that encompasses all of you as he talks about what the kingdom of heaven is like. Now, notice this too, because the disciples are not worried about the message that he's giving. They're not upset about the story itself. They've actually missed the story itself, in my opinion, because they come to him and they say, why do you keep talking in parables? Do you understand that they are more concerned about the method than they are about the message? They're more worried about Jesus' method of teaching than they are about the message that he's teaching, which is concerning because that means they just missed the entire message because they're so worried about the method. And I would just say, this is just a side note, but I would say many of us live our lives the same way. We're in our story as things are playing out and God is trying to teach us lessons within our own story of our lives, that most of us are more worried about the method of how God's teaching it to us than we are about the message that he's trying to get across to us. When we go through difficult times, the struggles we go through, the things that we're like, God, why are you doing this to me? We're so worried about the method of why he's doing this to us that we forget to ask what he's teaching us in the midst of it. And the disciples do the same thing. So Jesus gives them a little bit of an insight to this, okay? We're going to go through this very quickly. If you have time later, go through this on your own. But this next passage here, we're going to go through this really quickly to kind of skip through here because I know it's Mother's Day. We got to keep moving here. You got like lunch plans and stuff. And if you don't, I'm sorry, guys, I just threw you under the bus. It says this, so he replied, because the knowledge of the secrets of the kingdom of heaven has been given to you, but not to them. Who's you? Who's you in this situation? The disciples, right? Them is the crowd. He's saying, you guys have this secret. You understand this, but not to them. Whoever has will be given more, and they will have an abundance. Whoever does not have what they have will be taken from them. This is why I speak in parables. And here's what he's saying. So he says this, though seeing, they do not see. Though hearing, they do not hear or understand. Okay, so he's trying to kind of lay out, if I speak in these parables, it's not just bullet points that you can absorb and walk away with. You have to wrestle with it. You have to think about it. It actually has to become part of you. That's the whole point of the parables, is to try to have something that you have to be a part of. You have to understand it. You have to wrestle with it. It's not going to be easy bullet points on a screen. In them is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. He's talking about the crowd. In this crowd is fulfilled the prophecy of Isaiah. This happened about 800 years before this moment. Isaiah wrote these words. This is in Isaiah 6. You will be ever hearing but never understanding. You will be ever seeing but never perceiving. Now, this is him talking about the Israelites. This is probably also him talking about us. That we will hear, but we will not actually understand. We will see, but we will not actually perceive. For this people's heart has become calloused. They hardly hear with their ears. They have closed their eyes. Otherwise, they might see with their eyes and hear with their ears, understand with their hearts, and I would turn and heal them. Okay? So he's trying to say, like, this is us. You're hearing all the words I'm saying, but you're not getting it. You're not understanding it. You're seeing things, but you're not perceiving them. Then he says, but blessed are you, for your eyes are able to see, and your ears because they hear. Your ears actually hear. For I tell you, many prophets and righteous people long to see what you see, but did not see it, and hear what you hear, but did not actually hear it. Now, this is where we're going to flip from kind of the Gerald piece of my grandfather, who was a storyteller, talking about story. We're going to move into my grandfather Jack and take apart the story and talk about the actual farming that's taking place here. So this is what he says in verse 18. Listen then to what the parable of the sower means. Jesus, in his own words, is actually going to explain the parable. Jesus doesn't do this very often, by the way. This is a rarity. It's almost like if you remember, like when you were in school and you took a test and the first answer was already circled in for you to give you a little bit of a hint on how the test worked. That's what Jesus is doing here. He's like, hey, this is my first parable. I'm going to give you the cheat sheet on this one. Then the rest of them, you're kind of on your own. So good luck. And I'll warn you, some of the parables we're going to go through are like 2 sentences long. And you might want to be here for those weeks because they might be really short sermons. Some are really long. Some are very involved. We're going to see how it goes, okay? But there's a bunch of them. And he says, verse 19, when anyone hears the message about the kingdom and does not understand it, the evil one comes and snatches away what was sown in his heart. This is the seed that was sown along the path. The first set of seeds that were sown along the path are the people who hear it, but as they hear it, it's just bouncing off of them. They're not understanding it. Now, understand in this context is a word in the Greek that means something different than we think. We think understand means a head knowledge. It means that we understand it in our minds. We have grappled with it. But what's actually happening here is he's talking about not just understanding it with your head, but in your heart. Are you understanding it? Is it moving from your heart to your hands? Are you active with it? Understanding means a full understanding of it. See, there's actually a great book if you get bored and you have time to read it. There's a book that is called Amusing Ourselves to Death. And it's about where we're at right now in the viral and digital age with this. It's actually very interesting because he talks about up until the invention of the telephone specifically, that really news, when you heard news was designed to have action with it. So when you heard news in your local neighborhood, right, it was not global news, it was not national news. Most news was divided up to your region, to your area. And when you heard news, there was action associated with it. So when you heard, like my brother, he lived in a town in Indiana that had 800 people in the town, 800 people in this little town in Indiana. And he moved into a house there that was the old Miller place. Now, just so you know, the Millers had not lived there in over 80 years. But it was still the old Miller place, right? Like it didn't matter how long somebody else lived in there, what they did. You guys know these areas? Do you know these places, like these small towns? This still kind of happens. And when you heard in your town that something was happening at the old Miller place, it was not just for you to have the news about something happened at the Miller place. So next door, not far from where my brother was, there happened to be a fire at one point. And news spread around the town that there was a house that had a fire in it. And the conversation became there was a fire at the old Miller place. Now, that was not just news to be gossiped about. What was happening was, as news was spread around the town, it was spread around so that people would know the Millers need help. The people by the old Miller's place, they need help. Does that make sense? So when news was spread, it was like, hey, this house is on fire. We need to go do something about it. Do you see how news was attached to action? It was told to you so you could do something with it. But today, we have such a different view of news, don't we? We take in news as entertainment. We take in news as amusement. We even take in news on our news feeds as we scroll. And there's times where we see, oh, this person had a baby, this person had something terrible happen, whatever it is. And you're like, oh, man. Either way, you might say that's too bad, and then you just keep scrolling. You might just keep scrolling. Or you judge. That's the next thing we do. We just take it as a turn to judge people instead of actually learning that maybe the news that's given to us is supposed to be set into action. That's why the news is there in the first place. It wasn't just for us to hear it and walk on by. It wasn't for us to hear it and to keep scrolling. It was for us to hear it and apply it. It wasn't just for our heads to understand it. It was for our hearts to feel it and then for our hands to do something with it. What Jesus is saying here is when they've heard this message, they've heard the message, and that's as far as it got. But then it bounced right off, and they didn't understand it. They didn't receive it. It didn't move anywhere beyond their brains into any other part of their body. And therefore, it's just like these seeds that just bounce right off the path. They bounce right off. It does nothing. I would be fearful that in our culture, this might be the most common form of our faith that we have today. We've grown up in an American society that for years and years has been a Christian society. We've come under this umbrella that for years, in decades, and generations, it was a Christian society. And many of us have heard all the stories. We know all the things. We've heard this story before. Yet, we have not taken almost anything we've heard and actually let it change anything inside of us. I have a friend who I work out with every single morning. His name is Mike. Mike is a great guy. He went to a very strict Catholic school in high school, and since that point, he has become a pretty serious atheist. And his reasoning is, I've read all the things about God. I understand all the things about God. I just don't think he's really here. Don't think he exists. And so when you talk to Mike, he has a lot of scriptural background. It's not that he hasn't heard. He's heard. Oh, he's heard all the things. He has not understood any of the things. They have not moved beyond his understanding. He's heard it. That doesn't mean he's understood it, right? I have family members who I pray for specifically for this exact reason, because they grew up in church, they've been around the church, and they've heard it all before. They haven't understood it. This is a concerning place. And he says that's the first type of seed that was sown along the path. Now, the second one, he continues from there, and he says the second seed is the seed falling on rocky ground, on rocky soil. And it refers to someone who hears the word and at once receives it with joy. But since they have no root, they last only a short time. When trouble or persecution comes because of the word, they quickly fall away. Notice that phrase in there. Notice that phrase. When trouble comes or persecution comes because of what? The word. Now, we would think that trouble or persecution would come because of the world. Jesus is saying that actually the word, the teachings of Jesus, are going to be difficult. They are going to cause you a difficult time. And when those things come up, if you're not fully rooted in this, you're going to fall away. I think we can all kind of understand that at some level. What's scary to me is that, like, I've seen people who they think that what we're falling away because of is the world is taking them away, but instead what they're wrestling with is the teachings of Jesus. And I'm not going to lie to you, it scares me sometimes how easy we think the teachings of Jesus are. I was just reading a book called Everything Happens for a Reason and Other Lies I've Learned to Love, is what it's called. Everything happens for a reason, and other lies I've learned to love. And really the book talks specifically about her research. This woman did research just on the prosperity gospel in America and where that came from and how that has happened in America. And what we've learned is that everything when you follow Jesus should just be easy and everything should be natural. And we'll see it in this parable. It should produce a whole bunch more of stuff. And we're going to get into that in just a second. I should be wealthy and healthy and wise. That's the way of Jesus. And we believe that about things. But what we fail to realize sometimes, and what we have a hard time, and what she's reconciling in the book, is that she is diagnosed with cancer herself. How do you reconcile a gospel like that when you are suddenly a 35-year-old woman who is dying of cancer? How do you reconcile those things? And we sometimes think that the teachings of Jesus should just be easy and it should all come together so nicely. But he's saying, no, the persecution and the trouble you might experience is actually from my teachings. It actually might come from Jesus' teachings. They are hard to wrestle with. I have a friend named Ollie who he was going into ministry just recently, but years ago he became a Christian very quickly. He really was on fire, loved Jesus, all this stuff. He became a Christian, and then midway through his understanding of Jesus, he realized, oh, if I keep following Jesus, I'm going to have to move out of the apartment I live in with my girlfriend, and I'm probably going to have to stop having sex with her at this point. And at that point, he was like, I don't think I want to follow Jesus anymore. And so he didn't. He stopped. He was out. Until a couple years later, things changed in his life, and he literally made all those changes and realized, I have to grapple with this if I want to follow Jesus. There's a reason Jesus teaches those things. It's not out of harshness or meanness, but it is the kingdom of heaven. It is the perfection he's talking about. He's saying, if you want to follow me, these are the teachings, and they will make your life better, but they're going to be countercultural, and they're going to be counterintuitive, and they're not always going to look like the world's kingdoms, but they will look better because they're from the kingdom of heaven, and you're going to have to wrestle with them. And if you're not rooted well, it's going to have really hard effects on you. That's one of the hardest things we're going to wrestle with is the word. Now, the next one that he talks about, the ones that were planted in the thorns, so that group, he talks about these thorns, and it's kind of interesting because these I think we understand better. So it says right after that, others in verse 7, others that were there. Oh, I'm sorry, in verse 17. So let's see here. 22, the seed falling among the thorns refers to someone who hears the word, but the worries of this life and the deceitfulness of wealth choke the word, making it unfruitful. Notice the two things he says that thorns are. One is that they're worries of this life. Secondly is deceitfulness of wealth. Worries and wealth. In fact, if you looked at this passage in the Greek, it doesn't even say the worries, plural, of life. It actually says the worry of life. Like just life has its own worry that's just always there. And the worry is one of the thorns that's just going to take away everything. Worry is going to come into your life. We see this in our generation, right? Like we see this as a thing with my generation and going younger. I'm at the highest side of the millennial generation. I'm not claiming to like really be much of a millennial. I'm at the highest side of that. As we see younger and younger, we've talked about this before, but you're seeing this burnout generation where more worry, more anxiety, more depression is happening more than ever. And that's happening, again, if you get a chance to read, there's a short paper by a guy named Bin-Jong Hoon, who is a German philosopher that was from Korea originally, wrote this incredible thesis. It's only about 80 pages long that changed the psychology community because it was about the burnout generation and about, again, how we have more wealth than we've ever had before. We have more ability than we've ever had before, yet we are more anxious and stressed than we've ever been before. And you could read that and say, well, you know, it's because we have all the wealth, and that's true. It's because we have all the things that we don't normally have. That's what's causing anxiety. That could be true. But reading it the other way, one of the things that I went back and read it actually a couple weeks ago because I thought it was interesting. And if you read it the other way, as you look at it from the millennial generation down, there is a real struggle with anxiety when you have been brought up and taught that you can do anything. You can be anything. And generations, we have taught our kids that. Generations above me have taught their kids that. There's more wealth than ever. There's more access to information than ever. You can be anything you want to be. And you know what happens then is as we put that upon people, they literally get more anxious and stressed because they're like, I can be anything. Great. And everything under that feels like a letdown. Everything under that feels like I'm not living up to the ability that I could or should have. We actually are putting more stress in that way. I'm not saying it's bad to teach your kids they can be things. Just saying, it can also have detrimental effects when we don't know what to do with all the things we have. And we don't. We have not figured out how to handle all the things we've been given. And we almost are teaching this on the other side of this thing. And we're almost like this stress, this stuff. I mean, I was in yesterday I had a friend who was in a really bad bike accident, and not like a motorcycle, like a bicycle. And I was getting him some food down at this green culture place over here. And while I was there just getting him food, I'm standing in the store, and there's a song playing on the speakers, and I do this thing because I'm a nerd, and I was listening to it, I was like, well, I like this song. And so I pulled out my phone, I was like, hey, Siri, what song is this? And it tells you what song it is if everybody's quiet long enough and you hold it up close enough to the speakers, it looks super cool to do that, by the way, if you're in public places. So you're like, hey, Siri, what song is this? And they'd be like, oh, nobody sees me over here. It's really cool. And so I was listening to the song, and I was like, I like the song. It was by this group called the Strumbellas, and I didn't know they had a new song out. And as I was listening to it, the song is called My Own Worst Enemy. And the song actually says, I know I can be whatever I want to be, but instead I am just my own worst enemy. Do you see this? We have the ability to do whatever we want, yet the real problem, the worries are coming from within. The anxiety comes from within. There's another song I was listening to this week from the girl in red, who's a TikTok star. I know a lot of you are big fans. But she had the song Serotonin that just talks about how she's on a lack of serotonin. She literally is in a place of burnout. We're creating this in younger generations. It's a very real thing that's happening. And part of it is the worry of this world. That is a thorn that's going to come and choke out the plant. But secondly, it's actually happening because there is a deceitfulness of wealth. We have more access to stuff than we've ever had before. We have more wealth. And I don't know about you, but when you think about when you were younger, for me at least, I started my career as a part-time youth pastor at a church in Lake Placid, Florida. I think they paid me about $46 a year. And that included like gas money and stuff. And I was like, this is awesome. I'm making bank. I really felt great about where my career was heading. And I was so excited about it. And I remember having that in me. I don't know if you remember those days, but it's funny that I thought less about money when I had less money. And I've thought more about money when I've had more money. Has anybody else had this experience? I didn't really think about it then. It wasn't really a big part of my mind. It's funny, the more we get, the more we think about, the more mind it takes up. And he's saying there's these two things that are going to choke this out. One is a thorn that is literally your worry, and one is a thorn that is your wealth. And here's what's going to happen is as this thing is growing, these thorns are going to come up and they're going to try to take over. Because here's the thing, your brain, my brain, it only has so much space. The truth is there's only so many nutrients that can really be absorbed. In the soil, from the sun, from the water, there's only so much that can really be absorbed, right? And there's two things fighting for it. There's this plant, this kingdom that's trying to grow up within it, but then there's these thorns. And guess what? The thorns, they want the same nutrients. They want the same sun. They want the same water. They're fighting for attention. We have this same battle going on in our mind all the time. There's this kingdom of heaven that is trying to come in and through us. And instead, it's being choked out because our minds are so divided with worry, with wealth, and with the kingdom. And both can't survive at the same time. One's going to win. And for many of us, that's where we find ourselves. And the last thing he says, I'll wrap up here. This is the last thing he says because he does give us a little bit of a heads up here. But there's seed that's falling on good soil. And it refers to someone who hears the word and understands it. Who hears the word and understands it. It produces this crop yielding 60 or 100 or 30 or times what it had. Now, do not read this. Again, I want to be really clear. This is not a parable about how you get wealthy when you follow Jesus. That it's going to produce 60 or 30 times what was sown. Notice what Jesus just said. Actually, one of the thorns is wealth. So this is not a prosperity gospel situation, but he's saying that the kingdom will reproduce. The kingdom, the people that are following Jesus, that will reproduce in and of itself. That type of lifestyle will be reproduced on this earth. But he says what it takes is someone who hears and applies, who understands it, who puts urgency behind it. I don't know if you have these fears, and moms, you might have these fears a lot. I have these fears. I have a friend, and we were, anyways, I'll call him John for today, but John was one of my best friends. So in college, John and I did everything together. John was a mentor of mine. His wife and him mentored Marie and I as we were getting married. And then I was in a band for years. And I toured across the country with John and my band. Every place we went, we stayed in hotel rooms together. We slept in the van together. We drove literally across the country for years doing this together. We were together almost daily. John and I were best friends. We would go to these, and we led worship at all these conferences. We'd go to these conferences, and he was on fire for Jesus, which I know sounds very painful, but that was like a cool way to say that he was really into Jesus. He was like all about this. And we would go to all these places, we would see all these things, and we would lead people into worship, and I would watch John as he was so worshipful. He was just so about Jesus. We would do devotions together. We would read the Bible together. We would talk about things together. We went through life together. And we moved away, Marie and I moved away, and years later we came back here to Florida just a couple years ago. We were back here in Florida, and I called John almost first thing when I got back to Florida. I was like, hey man, I'm doing a worship thing. Would you come and play guitar with me? I'd love to see you again. He's like, absolutely, I'll be there. And so he and his wife came over, and they were here in the area while we did this worship thing. And we saw them, we saw their son. It was great to catch up with them. And then like literally the next week, we called them. And his wife says to me, well, I'm sure that you saw the tension going on between me and John. We're like, no, we didn't actually notice any tension. She's like, well, that's good, but we're getting divorced. I'm like, what's going on? And she's like, well, here's the thing. So a couple years ago, while you guys were gone, I found that John started working at another church. And while he was working at that church, they literally got film of John stealing money from offering, like literally pocketing money from offering plates. And she said, so he got fired from that church. And we left that church, and she said, I thought things were better, and I thought things were fixed. And then a few months later, I was going through his camera. He did photography. And on his camera roll, there were pictures of naked women who were not me, who I don't know. And so I started confronting him, and it turns out John had been seeing multiple other women, was actually on days where she thought he was going to work, was going to stay with another woman at an apartment that they were renting together. She said, I didn't know any of this about him. And she said, I'm really sorry to have to tell you about this. And since that day, John and his wife split up. John now lives with somebody who's like half his age and has gone that direction and has nothing to do with Jesus, nothing to do with any of this kingdom work. And here's my fear. I don't know if you have this fear. You might be like me, and you're like, how do I make sure that I am not that person? How do I make sure my kids are not that person? I don't know if you guys have the same fear. I have this fear all the time. What can I do about this? Now, what we know is that maybe the beauty and the frustration of God is he's not going to force himself upon them. He's going to continue, though. What we see about this parable is he's going to continue to scatter seed into their lives. He's not going to give up. The question is, if we, first of all, will model and secondly teach our kids how to be people who hear and understand or put into action. See, these stories aren't about how smart your mind is, they're about how soft your heart is. And are you having that curiosity of the kingdom? Are we instilling that in our children? Are we allowing them to get this place where they can not just hear the words that we're saying, because that's easy. We can teach them Bible stories all day long. The question is, are we letting them actually act on what they're hearing? Are we putting them into action? And I will say this, that does not begin with them, that begins with us. Are we hearing things and letting it change us? Letting it be seen in action? And then are we allowing them to do the same thing? My fear is that as we go through understanding the kingdom of heaven is that we don't start with soft hearts from the beginning. And that's why this story is so foundational. That's why this story matters so much, is that we have to have the soft hearts, the curiosity to continue, not just to hear the news, not just to hear the things, but to apply them and put action to them, to put urgency to them. And so I want to ask you the same questions. I want to give you just a second to kind of ponder these again. Because I want to ask you the same questions and allow you to process this for just a quick second while we're here. And then I promise I will let you out of here. First is, in this story, who am I in this story? And you might say there's 4 different soils. Are you the soil that was just the path? And that's as far as it got. And you've heard and just let this bounce off of you over and over and over again. Are you the soil that ended up being more like rock? And it's a limestone and it never got roots beneath that, and that's as far as it went. Is your heart the soil that's in these thorns that are growing up around it, and you're letting worry and wealth start to overwhelm this seed that's been planted and this plant that's starting to grow? Is that where you are? Or are you in this place where it's all good soil and this is reproducing and reproducing and reproducing? So who are you in the story? Where is Jesus in this story? Who's Jesus to you in this story? What have you learned about Jesus in this story? Third, what does this now mean to you? What does this mean to you where you are today? Fourth is, now what do I do about it? What do I need to change? What do I need to act on? So that I'm not just a hearer, but I'm a doer. I'm not just one that heard, but I understand. And lastly, what are the birds that have come along and picked up the seed? What are the thorns that are crowding you out? What do you need to eliminate? As you think through those, I would encourage you this week to just take time and pray through those as well. This morning as we close, if you would just stand with me, I'd like to pray for you as we close this morning. Let's pray. Jesus, I thank you for this time together. I thank you for your words for this story. I thank you for teaching us what the kingdom of heaven is and putting it in ways that we can understand it. I thank you for teaching us through these stories. I pray that as we begin just looking at these, a series of things, you would help us to understand more and more your kingdom and how it works here on this earth and how we can be a part of it. I pray that you would help us today to identify in this story who we are, who you are, what this means, what we do about it, and what are the thorns, what are the birds that have come along and taken root in our lives. I pray that you would help us to understand and identify those things and not just be people who have heard it, but people who do it. I pray that our children be people that see us acting these things out, that they would see that we're not just hearers of the word, but we would make radical changes as we change ourselves to be people who follow your word, even when it afflicts us, even when it's difficult for us, that we would follow your teachings because we do believe they are the best way to live. And so as we change those things, I pray our children would see that, we would have soft hearts, we would have a curiosity about the kingdom that continues to mold us and shape us no matter what age we're at, no matter how long we've been following you. We would be dedicated to continuing to be soft soil. I pray that we would not just look at your words and walk away from here just having more intelligence in our minds, but we would have a softness of our hearts and a willingness to move that knowledge from our heads to our hearts, to our hands, as we go into a community, into a world that needs it so much. We love you. We thank you for loving us. I pray all these things in your name. Amen. Amen. Have a great Sunday. Moms, have a great day.